What if the most feared warriors in history met an enemy they couldn't beat? We often think of the Vikings as unstoppable giants. We picture them with iron axes and shields, crushing everyone in their path. For centuries, they raided Europe and settled new worlds. They were the masters of the sea. But in the year 1000, they hit a wall. They found a land they called Vinland. Today, we call it North America. They arrived with ships and steel. Yet only a few years later, they fled in total terror. They didn't leave because the land was poor. They didn't leave because of the cold. They were driven out by a force they never expected. History books often tell this story wrong. They make it sound like the Vikings just got bored and went home. That is a lie. The truth is much more violent and much more interesting. The Norse were outsmarted and outfought. They were trapped on a beach miles from home, facing a local population that knew exactly how to win. If you stay until the end of this video, I will reveal the secret weapon used by the native people that haunted the Norse survivors for the rest of their lives. You will see why the invincible Vikings realized they had no chance of surviving in the New World. This is the real story of how the Norse lost America. To understand why the Norse failed, we have to look at their starting point. They didn't arrive with a massive army. They arrived with a small group of explorers. Their main base was a place called Meadows. Today, we find ruins there in Newfoundland, Canada. But these weren't ruins of a great city. It was a tiny outpost. It was mostly a place to fix ships and wait out the winter. The Norse were extremely far from home. Their nearest support was in Greenland. Greenland was already a harsh and lonely place. If something went wrong in Vinland, no one was coming to save them. They were completely on their own in a massive, unknown land. At first, things seemed fine. The Norse met the local people, whom they called the Skraelings. We know these people today as the ancestors of the First Nations and Inuit. The two groups even tried to trade with each other. The Norse offered cloth and milk. The locals offered valuable furs. It was a tense peace, but it worked for a short time. Then everything broke. The sagas tell us a story about a single stray bull. The Norse kept cattle, which the locals had never seen before. One day, a bull broke loose and charged out of the woods. It let out a loud, terrifying roar. The locals were startled and thought they were being attacked. They fled, but they didn't stay away for long. This small misunderstanding changed everything. The locals didn't just hide in the woods, they organized. They realized these strangers with the strange animals were a threat. The Norse thought their iron weapons made them the bosses of the land. They were wrong. They were a few dozen people living in wooden huts. They were surrounded by thousands of people who knew every trail and every hiding spot. The Norse had a foothold, but it was fragile. They were sitting in a trap, and the door was about to slam shut. Many people think the Norse had a huge advantage because of their technology. They had iron, they had steel swords, they had heavy wooden shields. Local people used stone, bone, and wood. On paper, it looks like a total mismatch. You might think a man in iron armor would be like a tank, but that is a big mistake. In the thick woods of North America, iron was actually a burden. It was heavy, it was loud, it was hard to fix if it broke. The Norse were used to fighting in open fields in Europe. They liked to stand in a line and clash shields. But the locals didn't play by those rules. The indigenous fighters were fast and light. They used bows and arrows with incredible speed. They could move through the forest without making a sound. Before a Viking could even draw his heavy sword, he would be hit by 5 arrows from the trees. The Norse weren't fighting an army. They were fighting a ghost force that vanished as soon as they turned around. The locals also had a terrifying weapon the Norse had never seen. The sagas describe a massive, dark ball that the locals swung from a pole or launched into the air. It made a loud, crashing noise when it hit the ground. It scared the Norse out of their wits. This weapon was a psychological nightmare. The Norse believed in magic and monsters. When they saw these strange flying objects and heard the screaming war cries, they panicked. They realized their iron swords couldn't hit what they couldn't catch. They were being picked apart by a faster, smarter enemy. The tech gap didn't help the Vikings. It actually made them slow and vulnerable. They weren't the hunters anymore. They were the prey.
The tension finally exploded into a massive fight on the beach. This wasn't a small argument. It was a full-scale war for the coast. Hundreds of local fighters arrived in skin-covered boats. They came out of the water like a wave. The Norse tried to form their famous shield wall. They stood shoulder to shoulder and held their ground. But the locals didn't just run into the shields. They used their numbers to surround the Norse. They threw stones and shot arrows from all sides. The Norse were used to being the ones who caused fear. Now they were the ones feeling it. The battle was a disaster for the Vikings. They started to break ranks and run back toward their ships. Even the strongest Norse warriors were terrified. One of the most famous stories from this battle involves a woman named Freydis. She saw the men running away and got angry. She picked up a sword from a fallen warrior and began to scream. She beat her chest with the flat of the blade and dared the attackers to come closer. This strange sight actually paused the fight for a moment. It gave the Norse enough time to reach their ships and push off into the water. They survived the day, but they didn't feel like winners. They realized that the local people were not going to stop. Every time the Norse tried to gather wood or hunt, they were attacked. They couldn't sleep. They couldn't work. The sagas tell us that even though the land was beautiful and rich, the Norse lived in constant dread. They were warriors who lived for glory, but here they were just waiting to die. The Battle of the Beach proved that one iron sword was no match for 1,000 angry neighbors.
The Norse had to face a hard truth. Even if they won one battle, they were losing the war. It all came down to a simple problem: logistics. The Norse colony was like a tiny island in a giant ocean of enemies. Their home in Greenland was 1,000 miles away. Crossing that ocean was dangerous and took weeks. They couldn't just call for more soldiers or more food. If a Norse warrior got sick or hurt, there was no one to replace him. Every person they lost was a huge blow. On the other side, the local people had a nearly endless supply of fighters. They were fighting in their own backyard. The Norse also realized they were outnumbered in a way they couldn't fix. In Europe, they could build a fort and hold it. But here, they didn't have enough men to build and guard a fort at the same time. They were exhausted. They spent every minute watching the tree line for movement. They couldn't farm and they couldn't hunt safely. The land was full of grapes and timber, but you can't eat wood and you can't pick fruit while holding a shield. The dream of a new empire started to fade. The leaders of the colony finally made a choice. It was a choice between pride and survival. They knew that if they stayed, they would all eventually be killed. They didn't have the numbers to win a long war. They packed up their tools, led their cattle back onto the ships, and turned their backs on North America. They chose to live. They left behind their wooden huts and a few broken tools. Those ruins are all that remain of the Viking dream in the New World.
So, who really won the first war for America? For a long time, we were told the Norse simply moved on. We were told the land was too far away to keep, but the truth is much more impressive. The Norse were driven out by people who protected their homes with incredible skill. The Vikings weren't defeated by a more advanced army. They were defeated by a people who were better at adapting. The indigenous groups used the forest, the weather, and their own clever inventions to beat the most famous raiders in history. The Norse retreat changed the world for 500 years. If they had stayed, North America might have looked very different today. Instead, the New World remained closed to Europe for centuries. This wasn't because the ocean was too big. It was because the people living there were too strong to be conquered. The Norse were brave, but they were also smart enough to know when they were beaten. They went back to Greenland and eventually back to Europe, carrying stories of a land they could never own. Now, remember the secret weapon I mentioned at the start? The Norse sagas describe a great blue-black ball that made a sound like a thunderclap. Historians believe this was a giant bladder or a leather bag filled with rocks and air. It was designed to create a terrifying noise and a massive splash. To the Norse, it looked like dark magic. To the local people, it was a genius way to cause a panic. It worked perfectly. It broke the Norse spirit and proved that sometimes the best weapon isn't a sword, it's fear. The Norse left Vinland, and the Skrælings kept their land for hundreds of years more. They are the true victors of this story.